So we are seeing different vendors out there that have this, pay for what you use model. Doug, could you talk a little bit about that and, any risks related to that, and obviously benefits that are there also?
Yeah, you hear about consumption-based pricing, you hear about serverless options or auto scaling. On the serverless side, it's important to note that it's an incomplete answer to cost control. Yes, there are oftentimes spiky workloads, data warehouse workloads where compute demands go up and down. You can't really anticipate. That's where serverless capacity or auto scaling is a fit. But whenever it's easy to add more data, add more users, add new workloads, scaling always seems to go in one direction, and that is up. And similarly on the consumption-based pricing, it's not really about cost control. The storyline is pay only for what you use, but in reality, it's kind of an open invitation to use more. As more data is added, as more users gain access to analytics, consumption tends to go in one direction, and again, that is up. So what really helps in our view is, with cost control is a range of subscription models. So you have choices and you have flexibility on what best fits your usage patterns. Your per query and capacity-based models are typical. All the better if there are multiple discount levels for time-based and capacity-based commitments, as well as some flexibility to exceed those levels, maybe temporarily or by a certain percentage without facing punitive pricing.
Okay, thanks. Mark, anything to add on that?
Yeah, and we're certainly seeing this in conversations at Yellowbrick, which was one of the reasons why we introduced a blended pricing plan of both on-demand and capacity-based subscription pricing that you could combine within the same deployment as well, for the reasons Doug mentioned. And I think not only are companies looking to reduce the magnitude of the overall spend, they want some cost predictability here, which is incredibly important for budgetary planning purposes as well. I think to key in more on the serverless side of things as well, you really are exposed to a true black box here when you're looking at serverless, and to the extent it goes beyond just the unpredictability of being on a pure on-demand, highly reactive sort of spend profile, but also the fact that some of the serverless cloud data warehousing solutions out there today will introduce more resources during the runtime of a single SQL query. So it becomes, and that's kind of non-deterministic, it becomes very, very difficult to run a query a couple of times and to truly understand whether you're going to pay the same cost per query each time you run it. And so I think there's the black box aspect of it, the unpredictability aspect of it. These are real forces acting against any sort of CFO's department that's looking to rein in the controls and get some predictability out of that. So when I speak to customers, a typical way that we introduce Yellowbrick is we encourage them to start small. Perhaps they are using on-demand consumption while they're characterizing their workload. And to Doug's point, when you see a fixed capacity component of your workload coming out of that, then move that piece to subscription. You get a much more favorable, predictable sort of spend when you do that, knowing that you can always burst out of that fixed capacity as and when you need it and when your business requires it. But that's something that we're getting a lot of traction on at Yellowbrick.
Great. All right, Arijit, back to you. Any thoughts on this topic and what you're experiencing?
Yeah, I think as an example, the Yellowbricks is a case, the i3ENs or i4Is are the instance of choice in AWS. So when you are doing this, or the customer has a choice to do this, the aspect of the selection of the instance is an important element on Intel, because that is also related to performance, IO optimized performance, and network optimized performance are core. So that the selection of the instances is a vector. The aspect of which platform you're choosing from Intel is a vector. FinOps tools has become a norm.
About this topic before we get to the next one, Mark, I'll just look back to you. Just maybe if you could give a little bit of color. I know you talked earlier about how there's costs that or savings that happen at the vendor level that don't always pass through to the customer. Can you talk a little bit about like what are the costs then for these serverless services, and do we see those passing on to the customer when there's savings, or do they, what does that look like?
Well, and I think the answer is no, frankly, because quite often what a lot of SaaS vendors in data warehousing are doing is massively over provisioning on the AWS side or the Azure side or whatever. And in the course, those costs are passed back on to the customer at the end of the day as another sort of markup. And, Arijit kind of opened the hood a little bit around what we do in the details around Yellowbrick. But to give you a little bit of flavor of how we've approached this, when you spin up data warehousing elastically with Yellowbrick in AWS, Azure, or what have you, we curate the Intel instances that we choose here, and we've deliberately chosen the AWS instances that we support to get the best price performance out of those instances. And that's completely transparent. We don't mark up those prices. You're literally paying the list price for AWS for that instance that's underpinning our deployment. And again, we hide the details. You abstract the details away, so the user experience is a SaaS-like experience, but you're running it yourself, which sounds like a massive contradiction in terms. And maybe 3 or 4 years ago, you really couldn't get away with that. If you look at the history of running databases and data warehousing in the cloud 4 or 5 years ago, you'd be stitching together EC2 instances and having to manage the infrastructure. With the advent of Kubernetes services like EKS and AKS, that's managing the elasticity for us in Yellowbrick. And we mask all of these details and provide a simple SQL interface to allow you to create new compute clusters, expand them, contract them, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I think we've latched onto the technical developments, both on the Intel side and in the cloud most recently, to be able to provide kind of a very, very simple, easy to consume data warehousing experience without exposing the details, but definitely just ensuring that customers only pay for what they need to as far as infrastructure is concerned.
Okay, great. Thank you.